It's difficult for me to make these concluding remarks, partly because of what we've just heard, and my wish, in a sense, is just to be silent after those utterances of Pessoa, which, as I think Amit was intimating, do seem to me to speak, at least for me. And also for another reason, and that is that it's quite impossible, I'm doomed to fail in these concluding remarks, for me to do any kind of justice to what over the last 2 days has been, certainly in my experience, a series of liberating illuminations. And what I can offer by way of some brief concluding remarks, I won't be long at all, is a triptych. And the triptych has 3 sides to it. And each of the sides is about failure. And each is populated by the different things that I've heard and thought about over the last 2 days. So you have to imagine this triptych as having little collages on it, which are quotations from some of the things that I've heard. I'm not going to name check people in this summary because I want to reserve something of that kind for a little later. So let me offer you the first part of the triptych. I'm not sure if it's in the center or to the right-hand side or the left-hand side. Indeed, it may be that the triptych that I'm constructing is one which keeps on moving its position, one in relationship to the other. It's a mobile triptych. But the title of the first triptych is The Intimacy of Failure. Okay? It takes up the title of Amit's talk. And John Berger is a writer who has been mentioned 2 or 3 times in this symposium. And I want to mention him again, partly because he's always on my mind as an English-born writer who became a European. He renounced his Englishness in a very deliberate and calculated gesture in the late 1950s, and lived thereafter on mainland Europe. And he's on my mind in that way because of something that was spoken about on the first day of this symposium, and that's the experience of political failure. I'm living in a country which, in my view, is undergoing a radical political failure. And I debate in my mind as to whether I should stay in it or not, or whether I should leave it. And I'm not sure what to do, but I'll come back to that, because again, part of the liberation and the illumination of this occasion has been to give me some ideas about how to live with that particular kind of sense of failure, of living in a country that is failing politically and perhaps culturally as well. But John Berger, the reason I want to invoke John Berger now is not only for that reason, it's because Berger, in an interview, I think, with Michael Greenblatt, and I can't remember whether he ever published this remark, spoke very interestingly about the relationship between writing and experience, or the writer and experience. And he obviously, well, he was thinking about the fact, of course, that experience is never simply given to us, it's never simply there, that it has, as it were, different dimensions to it. And he thought of the writing process as a kind of act which for him was framed in the metaphor of how close was the writer prepared to get to the experience, to go into the experience that he or she was seeking, and then what would they bring back from that experience? What would they bring back from that proximity, that intimacy in the form of their writing? And one of the things that has struck me particularly about this symposium, and in a sense it distinguishes it from some of the earlier symposiums that we've had, is the frankness, the candor, and the courage with which some of the speakers have spoken about the experience of failure. And I'm very struck too by the fact that the medium of that candor and of that courage often takes the form of telling a story, or telling an anecdote, or describing the experience of failure rather than simply analysing it. A failure to conceive, the political defeat that constitutes failure, the failure to commit suicide. These are all part of what's happened over these last 2 days. These tellings have been extremely important and powerful because it seems to me that they have helped to open up the possibility of a kind of inquiry, because I see these as forms of inquiry into the experience of failure, which is simply often prohibited or deemed to be inappropriate. And it's been, as I say, a very striking feature about the symposium, that willingness to get close to the experience of failure, to be intimate with the experience of failure, rather than to adopt an analytic distance from it, has been one of the distinguishing features of this symposium. So, in that intimacy, we hear about the voluptuousness of failure, for example. There's another level of intimacy, and that's the level of intimacy in language. Failure is intimate to us through the way in which we speak about it. We've heard of the failing light, of the relationship between falling and failing. It's intimate to us in our laughter, in the different ways in which we laugh at failure. And I'm struck by the fact that we've often not been quite able to understand exactly what that laughter means. Not mocking, perhaps, but undoubtedly the fact that failure makes us laugh, often makes us laugh, is one of the enigmatic features of it. And in art, too, that failure can become a creative idea in art. It's coded into each work of art. And of course, as we've heard repeatedly, it's a motif in modernism. I just have to have one caveat about that, by the way. Kafka is often invoked in this context as an example of an artist of failure, right? It is worth bearing in mind in the telling of this story, which in some senses I'm very sympathetic to, that Kafka had his daytime and his nighttime writing, and in his daytime writing he was extremely successful. He was regarded as one of the leading theorists of insurance in Europe, in the Austro-Habsburg Empire. He was not a clerk beavering away in a huge bureaucracy, tyrannized by his father. Far from it. He was what we would now call a very successful executive. And Kafka, the successful executive, needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about these other dimensions of failure. Indeed, the executive modernist is an idea that suddenly occurs to me, and which we should perhaps explore in more detail. Wallace Stevens comes to mind, another executive modernist, and in a sense T.S. Eliot as well. So let's not forget that particular relation to the market. So the intimacy of failure is there, and then I want to move on to the second part of my triptych, and this part of the triptych is called the impersonality of failure. So intimacy and impersonality. We have been very, I think, ably instructed or inducted into the fact that the senses of failure that we might feel depend upon a condition of, or an understanding of the self, namely the self as a cause, as a causer of things, which is historically contingent. I mean, that's to say, it hasn't always been the case that the self has been thought of in this way. Another striking quotation is this: the only failure is that we think in terms of the concept of failure. And thinking in terms of that concept is, of course, dependent upon thinking about the self in a certain way. Again, I'd want to add a little bracket to that, because I think there's a dimension of the discussion of failure which is connected to this, and indeed which is associated with the work of Nietzsche, another philosopher who we've thought about and heard about a bit over the last 2 weeks. And that is the way in which failure, as we conceptualize it, as we get to that distance of conceptualizing it rather than living it intimately, is of course connected to both self-accusation. I accuse myself when I think of my failures, and of course by the accusation of others. I have failed myself, you have failed me. These are all forms of locution that are closely connected, that are part of the vocabulary of failure, part of the cultural vocabulary of failure. And as Nietzsche very tellingly remarks in The Genealogy of Morals, and he's thinking very much about the idea of the self as cause and why we have to have this idea of the causative self and the notion of responsibility that goes with it. And that is because we need to have somebody to blame. We need to be able to blame people, and in order to be able to blame people, we have to assume that they are of a certain kind. Opposed to that conception, and again very interestingly engaged in some of the conversation, is another motif and also an idea, and that is the idea of the dance. The figure who dances. The figure who dances is freed from the constraints or the possibilities of success and failure. That's been one of the emancipatory images that has been proposed to us on a number of occasions. And again, that struck me when I was in Calcutta before I came to Delhi, and each time I come to India, I think about it where I am, and I try to find out what contrasts and comparisons there are. And it was very uncanny that I was in my hotel room in Calcutta thinking about what it was that I was in, and I realized I was in a culture that had invented gods who dance. And of course, if there's one salient difference, I said, are there any gods who dance in either the mythology of antiquity or in Christianity? And there are none. I cannot, well, perhaps somebody can think of a god who dances in those traditions, but I don't think I can immediately think of one. And it's a very interesting complication, it seems to me, that adds to our conception of the notion of success and failure, that we in the West have a great deal of difficulty in imagining a God who dances. There's an impersonality about failure in another sense, but is connected to that I've just been describing, and that is the notion of failure as an event. It's just something that happens. And it may indeed be connected to notions of good luck and bad luck. It obviously means that we are no longer in that world of the agent as cause, of the self as cause. We're in some other kind of world, I think. But this produces one of the paradoxes or the movements that we've been tracing. That is to say, what I think is a success turns out in the regard of others to be a failure, and what I regard as a failure turns out to be in the regard of others a success. I mean, that's to say there's this curious way in which what is a success to me becomes a failure to others, what is a failure to me becomes a success to others. And we heard some very vivid descriptions of that yesterday in the course of an account of a creative life in film. There's a third and final part of the dialectic, okay, the intimacy of failure, the impersonality of failure, and it's this that I want to end with. And this is about the dialectic of failure It's the dialectic of failure question mark, because I don't think there is a certain dialectic or a unique dialectic of failure. But it draws me back to where we began, and it draws me back to the way in which these symposia have been engaged in a persistent attempt to find a space and a distance from a dominant ideology and a dominant experience. And it's one that's summarized in Amit's position paper opening remark, that we live now in a free market culture in which success is not good fortune or reward for accomplishment, but basic survival. Okay, success is basic survival. Now, the point about this, what is very interesting about this relationship between success and failure, is that it makes of success and failure a zero-sum game. You're either a success or you're a failure. Okay, and if you're not the one, you're the other. But it's not the case that the two are put into a dialectical relationship one to another. They're put into a relationship of, as it were, frozen opposition of one to the other, and you're going to get. And the fear is you're going to get either trapped in failure, and then there's another interesting concern about what happens when you get trapped in success. Now, there's a bracket here which we haven't mentioned, but I think which is worth bearing in mind. Not that I'm going to analyse it now. But it hasn't been mentioned, and that's the role that celebrity culture plays in this imagining of success, and the way in which we've invented a whole pantheon, if you like, of minor deities who, for us, incarnate in different ways the life of success, the life of happiness. But once we put success and failure into a dialectic, it seems to me that all sorts of things happen that freezing of the dialectic prevents. And one way of summarizing that, I've had a line from Dylan in my head, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact song that it comes from now, but this is Bob Dylan. There ain't no success like failure, and failure
Love minus zero, no limit.
Love minus zero, no limit, and failure's no success at all. Okay? It's a wonderful riddling remark. There ain't no success like failure, and failure's no success at all, insofar as the second part of the statement appears to cancel out what the first part of the statement utters. But that's an example for me of a song which, whether he intended it or not, brings out something about the dialectic of failure. Now, this dialectic has been expressed in various ways. Obviously, it's been expressed simply through the necessary attention to the fact that success and failure seem to fall into some kind of sequence, that after success comes failure, after failure comes success. And this has to do with the thought of our raising ourselves up and falling down. Again, Wordsworth comes to mind there, resolution and independence, as high as we have mounted in delight, in our dejection do we fall as low, writes Wordsworth, namely that there's a sort of pattern here which we can't escape in terms of thinking about the way in which success metamorphoses into failure, failure metamorphoses itself into success. But I think that way of putting it is in danger of precluding something which for me has been very important about this conference, about this symposium, and that is the way in which between success and failure there is an important space which we can occupy and which we are forbidden to occupy if we take too seriously or if we become invested in the idea of success or failure as a zero-sum game. I'm thinking about the very powerful evocations of what I would call the groups of solidarity that arise out of moments when failure is shared amongst those who failed. It's not that they have become successful in that moment of sharing, but I think we live in a moment when these collectives, fragile, perhaps temporary perhaps, are gathering together in ways that offer at least some resources for hope. And I think we need to keep that space in mind, the space between success and failure. There's also another space or another way of conceiving this, which is to live outside success and failure. I was very interested in the remarks about pure failure, which seems to me to be, again, in some sense, outside the dialectic, namely inhabiting failure, but in such a way that you live it without any prospect of it becoming a success, or of it transforming itself into a success. Now, there's a great deal more to be said about that. There's a great deal more to be discriminated about those dialectics. But I do think that one of the emancipatory, the liberating potentials of these last 2 days has been simply that ability to begin to think again in various different ways about the way in which success and failure are intricated one in the other, and the way in which that in turn can become a source of creativity. So that's the triptych: the intimacy of failure, the impersonality of failure, the dialectic of failure. That's really all that I have to say by way of a kind of outline summary, a very inadequate summary of what has been happening over these last 2 days. But I do want to, in conclusion, just say some words of thanks. The first is to say thank you to Ashoka University for hosting this event so generously. I'm now speaking, I suppose, in a representative fashion as a representative of the University of East Anglia, and I want to express my appreciation and gratitude in that representative function to Ashoka University. I then want to step out of that representative function and speak, if you like, more personally. I want to thank all the speakers over the last 2 days for their remarkable and their varied contributions. I want to thank the audience for attending in various stages, in various numbers, and in various proportions. My sense is that the level of attention has been unusually high. Before I move to my final thanks, I just want to confess a failure, okay? Because we've been asked to confess failures, or not confess them, at least to mention them. I, for a period of 6 years, between 2004 and 2010, was the founding dean in a reorganisation of the university I work in, of a faculty of arts and humanities. And I had a vision that I wanted to pursue in developing this faculty, which was that it would be a place where different subjects were not held at a distance one from another, but interlaced one with another, crossed over one with another, in different and varying ways. My idea was that there would be an active dialogue and engagement between the creative and the critical, between, as it were, the immediacies of the creative and the external perspectives of the critical, and a place where people, as Derrida has put it in a very interesting essay on the university, would be able to say whatever they liked, where speech would be free, insofar as it can be free. Now, I spent time trying to do this, and it was a completely quixotic endeavour. Within 2 years of the ending of my deanship, the whole thing had been unpicked and had been changed by something else. I mean, I'm not saying that critically. I mean, that's just the way life is. That's the way in which the circumstances prevailed, and so that went. So there's this. I'm a sort of Don Quixote figure in that respect. Not entirely, but certainly not in the way that I'd hoped. And one of the things about the experience of being here is that this really quite often has felt to me like exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to achieve when I set out to create that faculty, or to bring it into being. Because all those things, different disciplinary perspectives, an active relationship between the creative and the critical, people speaking in their own voices rather than in the voices that they think they're supposed to speak in, all that has been happening. And I'll come to say something about why that's happened in a moment. But there's another bit of thanks that I need to do, and that is to thank the administrator of the workshop, Manasi Thakkar, for all the work that she's done in getting us here, in supporting us while we are here. So, Manasi, thank you very much. And finally, I do want to thank Amit, who is really the true inspiration of these occasions, and to thank him for bringing together, with all the risk and the chance and the haphazard that involves, the elements of such a powerful and remarkable event. So, Amit, thank you very much indeed.